Hello, I'm Carrie from Carrie Dubber Therapy, and this is part 2 of my series of workshops on working through imposter syndrome. Now, if you were attending last week's session, you would have understood maybe a little bit more about how you might notice self-esteem and imposter syndrome within yourself. So we looked at sort of common unhelpful thinking styles and also the different ways that you can recognize imposter syndrome. So what I'm going to do is go through the a rundown of feedback, I guess, from last week, and then move us through to understanding a little bit more about how you can tackle the self-doubt, the inner critic in particular. So giving you some strategies, some tips on what you can do and how you can do that for the very common thinking styles that turn up when you are experiencing imposter syndrome. So I hope you found last week's session useful. There is the Facebook group Working Through Imposter Syndrome to join. And there's also my email if you can get in touch whenever you want to just touch in and see, are you on the right track? If there's any help or support you need, I'm very willing and able to help and support you. So this is the agenda for today. So we've got quite a lot to get through. So we'll take questions at the end, and anybody who wants to can put something in the chat if you need to. But I will open up for questions at the end and take it off record at that point. The general agenda then for today, any feedback anybody has, but I will just go through what we talked about for anybody who's joining who didn't see session 1, just a quick précis of what we covered. And then we're going to turn directly to challenging the inner critic. So what is the inner critic? How do we recognize it within ourselves? And then I'm going to just tackle three ways that it might turn up. So the fear of failure, which is very common when we are struggling with our view of ourselves, our expectations, and those of other people. There's also that comparing ourselves and really putting ourselves down in that comparison. So seeing ourselves as much less able and capable than somebody else, seeing what they're doing well, but not really balancing that with what they might be struggling with too. And by the same token, really not emphasizing what you're doing well, but really noticing and emphasizing what you're not doing well. So how to tackle that. And then we look at catastrophizing thinking. So again, that's a very common thought process that happens, and we all experience catastrophizing thoughts from time to time, but it can really build, and really that sense of the future is becoming very negative and awful. And it's like the worst thing that can happen. And we're living as though that's going to happen all the time. So we're going to look through that as well. We're going to use a classic sort of cognitive behavioral therapy technique, which is thought records. So writing down and understanding what we're saying to ourselves, noticing how we're feeling, what actions we're taking, what we're avoiding, and then challenging some of those unhelpful ways that we've been talking to ourselves, challenging that. So we're going to look at those 3 styles and use those with thought records to get you into the sort of way of understanding and maybe able to challenge for yourself some of those thoughts. And then, my expectation is that you can use some of that in the next week. So be able to sort of capture and recognize when that critical voice comes in. Am I comparing myself badly to others? Am I setting my expectations too high? Or am I going over and over what's terrible about this, what's going to go wrong, and getting stuck in that and not able to take action? So being able to recognize it, then challenge it. And then the final piece of the puzzle today is taking action. So what can I do differently if I'm thinking about this from a more balanced perspective? What would change? What would I do differently? How can I practice that this week in order to start to push back on imposter syndrome and start to feel more confident and comfortable in what you're doing? So that's the aim for today. So quite a lot to get through. So again, so with feedback, if anyone has any feedback, let me know in the chat now. But if not, just sharing ideas, be open and respectful. So that is to yourself as well as when you're hearing other people. So be respectful to yourself. That's really important. And just really take the time to what have I noticed from this last week? What might have been different, or how I might be experiencing my thoughts slightly differently because of what we talked about last week? And are you starting to really pay attention and sort of see that inner critic is just a voice in your head? It doesn't mean it's true or it's you. It's just the way you're talking to yourself in that moment. All right. So there's nothing coming through on the chat. So we'll move on. But, feel free at any time to talk to me. All right. So last time we looked at how the past influences how we deal with situations now, that our experiences in the past affect our thoughts, our habits, how we feel about ourselves or feel about other people. Now, past experiences can come from childhood. Often our self-worth is tied up with our experiences of how caregivers, those people nurturing our well-being, presented difficulties or supported or encouraged us or not. If we felt like we're in competition with our siblings or that the expectations are really high within the family, that can have an impact on how we see success and failure, how we understand our ability to manage or our value. Is it dependent on attaining things, or is it in and of itself, you are enough, you are valuable just being you? So all of those things can impact then on our view of ourselves, which impacts on how we go about taking on challenges or dealing with something new, or being around people, or dealing with difficulties. So hopefully you took some time to sort of think through what might be your trigger points that come about because of something that's happened in your past. Now, it could not only be childhood, but it might be how you've experienced relationships or how work situations have caused difficulties or undermining of your value and worth. And that can be as an adult, it doesn't have to be as a child. So it's just recognizing for yourself, are there any experiences and what sort of triggers then lead you to have more negative views about yourself, or might make you feel like in order to be valued, I need to do something significantly, like work harder, stay longer, prove my worth in some way, show my experience, show my qualifications, like we were talking about, and we'll come to that in a minute, the different styles of imposter syndrome. And the impact can be seen moving forward, and that's what we were talking about, that if you're not delegating, if you're not dealing with problems effectively, so you're sort of going over and over stuff, worrying about things, maybe putting things off, or not wanting to talk to people or talk through what's going on or what's you're finding difficult, then that's going to have an impact on your work, on your home life, in the balance of life, and it's going to impact on your well-being. So that was what we were talking about last week, and it's really helpful to sort of have your own sense of how that turns up and shows up for you. And we also briefly looked through, and I'm not going to go through that in any detail today because that's what we looked at last time, but these are the sort of common thinking errors in imposter syndrome. And today we're going to look at the top three. So all or nothing thinking, that compare and despair, and catastrophizing. So that's what we're going to look at. All right. So when we talk about the inner critic, What we mean by that is that voice in your head, and it can be your own voice, or it could be another sort of sounding voice. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. We all do it. We all have conversations in our head. We're all sort of analyzing and reviewing how we are experiencing something, bringing on board memories, bringing on board other people's sort of opinions and thinking those things through. So we are sort of trying to rationalize and make sense of the world around us. And that happens through our intellect and through that voice, that talking to ourselves. But the difference is we can sort of say that there's different voices, more neutral, more encouraging, enthusiastic, but there's also maybe the critic, that voice that's putting ourselves down or looking at things from a very negative point of view. And we can sort of say that maybe it's coming from a position where it's trying to ensure that we are protecting ourselves from harm, that we are looking out for the dangers before they are arriving in order to help ourselves. But when we are constantly just listening to it and in a critic, we're almost feeding that voice, and that voice becomes louder and more likely to be the first voice that we hear in our head. And it's coming from a place of fear, because if it's in a negative position, it's looking for danger, looking for signs that something might happen that's not very good, or how we're doing something that's not very good. And often, if you pay attention, we are putting ourselves down in a way because we are almost expecting or planning or preparing ourselves for other people's criticism. So it's like we're getting there first. It's like, well, if I can beat myself up, then nobody else can do that because I've already done it. So I'm not going to be blindsided by other people's judgments. But you can see the problem in that all we're doing is focusing on what's going wrong, what we're not doing well enough, what, we think might go wrong in the future, how bad things are going to turn out. And it can make us feel much more anxious, unhappy, wary, less engaged, less content. So if we are feeding that voice and hearing that voice more and more, it becomes louder and it infiltrates and obscures what's really going on. So the key to this is to be able to recognize it, be curious and also compassionate, because it's coming from fear. It's coming from we don't feel confident or comfortable. There may be a point of uncertainty, which is often the case. So when we're feeling very uncertain, we can then overlay the uncertainty with, okay, well, what might go wrong? Let's plan and prepare for that. But if you can step back and be curious and compassionate about that understand it's coming from fear, but if you can take care of yourself and not just listen to that voice, but turn that volume down and hear what else might be relevant for that situation. Balance out that critical voice with the more positive voice in your head, or even the neutral one, to sort of be balanced in the moment, is what we are looking for. So it's just understanding that the critic is there because we think it's helping us, but of course, when it's excessive and loud like this, it's not helpful at all. So the first of the thought patterns, those thinking styles that we were looking at in the last session and is very relevant for imposter syndrome, is the all or nothing thinking. Now, what I mean by that is it's either all got to go well or it's all wrong. It's black and white in its nature. So we sort of say, unless everything goes to plan, then I won't be able to cope. It's not good enough. I'm rubbish as a person. It becomes very polarized. So it's either all up there or not. Now, people with perfectionism often experience this thinking quite commonly, and it's very hard to overcome because however much you're trying, unless you do everything right, then you have that sense of failure. And so it makes you anxious. And then when you're trying something new, you're pushing yourself harder and harder, and it feels almost impossible. And it makes things feel very uncomfortable. So some of the unwanted strategies and outcomes that come from this fear of failure is because we are setting such high unrelenting standards for ourselves, and then you're not able to reach them, and then that feeling of failure. So instead, it's about being more realistic about maybe the time frames and thinking about, if this was somebody else, what would I expect from them? Is there a consistency in my expectations for myself with other people? And that's your balance. That's what you need to be thinking about, because if you are balancing that out and not expecting others to reach that standard, you have to think, well, how helpful is it? I know this about myself, that I get drawn into that with that standard, but is that from my past? Is that something maybe I can start to challenge? How else can I think about this? So sometimes just moving one of the elements to start with, so if it's time frame or how much you're going to get done, or how much you're going to report to somebody else, or how much detail you're going to go into, just think about one thing and try and change that in terms of the expectations to start with. The next one that's around, when you've set your goal or target, it may be really too high, but if you don't reach it, then you're giving yourself that failure element. It's all for nothing. I've worked really hard to reach it, but I haven't been able to. And the cost on your other elements of your life, you may be putting other things on hold, might then cause you to feel very unhappy, doubly so, because not only did you not reach your target, but also you've put aside all these other things. So now I'm failing in my personal life as well as in my professional life. The other side of it, if you don't reach your target, if you're worried about that and you've not reached it last time, you might avoid it. And so then that causes more problems. So on the other side of that is to recognize that failure, the way we talk to ourselves about failure, is just our version of it. It doesn't mean other people have the same version. Other people have different ways of looking at failure. The common thing that Dyson, from the Dyson company, is his company is built on failure, because they have to keep trying and testing and failing and testing until they get the product that they want. And it's all part of the process. So there is another way of looking at this when things don't go to plan, when you don't get everything done or don't get the outcome that you were hoping for, expecting, that it isn't all a failure, that it's a learning point and you're moving through it. So it's how do I build a different way, a construct for myself that is more helpful and flexible. Another common way of thinking about this, fear of failure, is that making a mistake means that it's all wrong. So it means that somehow you're not good enough and you start beating yourself up. So there's no in between, there's no grey. So if there's a mistake, then that's terrible and I'm a bad person, I'm not good enough for this. And it becomes something where you're really hard on yourself. So here it's like looking at the outcomes as work in progress. Try and focus more on, you're not going to know everything as you're going through it, and you're aiming for the outcome, but along the way, dealing with whatever comes up and finding out what you need to know as you're going along. So you're looking at the process, and the outcome is not what you're holding on to as meaning success. The success is taking the steps. Each one is a success in itself. And finally, getting something wrong means I'm a total failure and you're feeling demoralized. And that's when you can start to utilize what we're going to do in a minute, which is writing down your thoughts, put them on a thought record like the ABC one, challenging it, finding another voice, finding another way of talking to yourself, and also reminding yourself of what's gone well before. So not focusing so much on what's going wrong, but balancing it with what's going well too, so that you can really keep that in mind and not get caught out in this way. So let's take a look at an example. So this is the ABC that we were looking at last time. And in last time's one, we were just starting the process of stepping back. What's the activating element where I'm noticing the thoughts? So that activating triggers, it could be a a thought, a situation, or even a feeling within you that's activating. And then what are the thoughts and meanings? That's what we're looking at. And then the consequences, how do we feel and what do we do in response? So this is taking it a little bit further. So once we recognize those unhelpful thoughts that might be around the all or nothing thinking and around success and failure, then we can start to try and put in a more balanced perspective. So seeing that it's only one way of looking at it when we are talking to ourselves in this all or nothing way. That's only one way. And we don't have to continue with that if we don't want to. We can choose once we start to step back in this way. So let's have a look. I put down a few examples, but we're going to look at making a mistake because that's a common one for all or nothing. So that's the trigger point, and it sets off these thoughts. I wouldn't make a mistake if I was good enough, and something bad is going to happen now. So those thoughts might come into your head straight away. And the meaning, that underlying meaning of what that means for you is that making a mistake shows I'm incapable. And if I get things wrong, I will never get them right. I must be a failure. So it goes into that deeper level of feeling a failure and that fear of being a failure. And what you are assuming is a point of recognition is a mistake means that about me. Whereas of course it doesn't. So the alternative, starting to sort of think, well, how can I see this in a little bit more flexibility? Am I the only one who makes mistakes? Or do other people make mistakes? Look around you in the office. Ask people, when they make a mistake, how do they deal with it? What do they say to themselves? What's their view of mistakes? That might help you to think about it differently and put that in place in a thought record. If you were sort of talking to a child, say, who was trying something or learning something in school, would you be expecting them to know something straight away? Would you be wanting them to have a go and then learn from that and try again and repeat until it felt like they'd understood and was able to do it? And if that's the case, is that possible for you to try and take that approach on yourself? So that approach, if I'm learning something new, it's natural I won't get things right straight away, and I can learn from this mistake and I'm growing in my knowledge. So getting something wrong doesn't mean I'm a failure. So if we come to those alternative thoughts, then what might be alternative behaviors? So rather than having to check everything for mistakes, being fearful of what people might think if I make a mistake, so never get anything wrong, stay late, work harder, or avoid everything altogether, depending on your approach to this. It doesn't help update or help you learn that maybe it's okay and you can cope with it. So alternative behaviors might be giving the difficult task another go, so not giving up on it in that all or nothing way, but trying it again and again. And maybe asking other people for help so that you can learn how to do it, or asking other people how they dealt with problems, like I was saying before. And when you're checking something, don't overcheck it, but just let it go. Feel the anxiety for that fear of making a mistake, and then just see what happens. So this is an option. This is just an example, but there's a blank one for you to try out if this is something that you notice commonly for yourself, and just work it through in your own way of what examples come up for you. So this is the all or nothing element. Now, the second one that we wanted to talk about today was compare and despair. And it comes from an underlying sort of sense that comes with imposter syndrome of not really feeling capable enough, not feeling good enough. It can really tie into self-esteem and self-worth. Not always, but commonly it can. And what we sort of recognize with this compare and despair is that we are judging ourselves against other people. So seeing our self-worth in relation to what other people are doing, saying how well they're doing, how successful you believe them to be. So seeing other people's successes, so these unwanted strategies, as meaning that you are doing less or what you're doing is not as valid, not good enough. So you're making that judgment for yourself. But instead start to notice more what you are doing and let go of the attention on what others are doing. So maybe reducing your social media attention, just focusing on the things that are helpful, but not just scrolling through, just looking at how well people are doing and how that makes you feel. So if that's making you feel a bit down or disturbed in some way, maybe just let that go for a while and see what happens. Now we can also rate our self-worth based on our unrealistic views. So we're not really paying attention to how much effort something might have taken someone, how differences in their circumstances might make something of a different challenge to some people than others. So depending on, social circumstances, cultural, gender, all of those aspects are going to influence maybe a task or experience for somebody else. So if we are not really putting that into the mix, we are unfairly judging ourselves against somebody else when there's no even playing field for this. So just find opportunities to talk to yourself in a more supportive way. Think again about how you would maybe talk to somebody else about that. If you are sort of noticing that somebody's doing well, maybe see that more as motivation for yourself rather than punishment. So, oh, what was it about what they did that maybe I can take on board and utilize rather than focusing on the things that you've not done so well in your own mind? Because you might be undermining your own ability and your own capability if you're not looking at what you're good at, what you're successful at, what you have worked hard at and overcome. So that's the other thing to help challenge, is recognizing those things, write them down. It's really important to write things down at this stage because it forms a more conscious task in the mind, and then you're more able to focus on it and to pay attention to it. It becomes more real. So when we're just thinking in our head, it's one thing. When we say it out loud, that becomes more prominent. And then when we write it down and even read it back to ourselves, it's much stronger. So we're getting a different element when we do it in that way. So here's a thought record that links with that idea of feeling like you're a fraud, being judged, which is part of that imposter syndrome feeling when we really feel like at any moment, someone's going to find us out because other people can do so well and really we can't do as well as them. So it's that noticing you're having the thought about being judged. That's the first thing, really being aware of that inner struggle you might be having and how that makes you feel. So that ability to think about everyone makes mistakes, but also that, you are the one that can do things as well as other people. So the emphasis is not so much on the mistake, meaning you're a failure, but more on asking for help and showing that you're as good as anybody else and you can, be that person that other people sort of recognize too in you. So listen out more for people's praise in you, of when they're showing you that you've done something well. Write those things down because that's going to help you. Finally, in the third thinking style we're going to look at today is the fearing the worst outcome. So that catastrophizing thinking. So the unwanted sort of strategies might be believing the worst is going to happen. So worrying over and over about what possibilities might come about. So they're not, you're not tending to look at what might go well. It's always planning, preparing for what's going to go wrong and how bad it's going to be, how awful it's going to feel, what's going to happen as a consequence of this awful, awful thing. And it tends to build and escalate, and we get more anxious and more worried. So those anxious and worried feelings then almost feed back into our sense of self and make us feel even less confident that we can cope and more likely that the bad thing is going to happen. So then we start to overplan, over-prepare because we don't feel as confident, and we are sort of noticing and reminding ourselves of when things went wrong before and how bad that was and when that happened to somebody else and what happened from that situation. And we can get ourselves into a really high frenzied state, and it just feels all-consuming and overwhelming. And the problem with that is that we're not really focusing on anything that's going on around us. We're in our heads at that point, and we are absorbed in that negative perspective. So we're unable to take on board any support that might be available or what the reality really is around us, because we're so in our head thinking the bad is going to happen. So a way to challenge that is accept that the ideas about the future are just that they are just ideas. It's just one way of looking at it. And I'm noticing I'm having the thought about the future is one way to just step back, because it's a thought that I'm having. To help you build a more realistic view, it's trying to help your brain move and shift to look at more helpful possibilities. And in order to do that, we have like the worst and the best case scenarios. So it's, if you've already got the worst case in your head, so saying, well, what's the best, the absolute best that can happen right now? And it's trying to challenge yourself to say, well, here I am today, and what's the absolute best that can happen at the weekend? And it hasn't happened yet, but neither is the worst case scenario. So they haven't happened, they're not real yet. They're just imaginary things that are going through my head. And it's starting to remind yourself of that the best is not very likely, neither is the worst. And then coming to somewhere in the middle. So what is more realistic? What's more likely? Once you've done that, it's also helpful to try and redefine how you cope with problems. So what have you done before that's helped you? How have you overcome? What problem-solving skills do you have? What experiences do you have that tell you that however bad something can feel, you get through it? So bring your attention to those things, first of all. And then once you've done all of that, come back to the here and now. Just say, well, you can't change it. You can't make the future happen now. You have to wait for it. So best to be focusing on the here and now, right now. So that's a good strategy for dealing with that. And then coming to the thought record again. So if you're not successful in an interview, say as being an activating sort of situation that might be happening, you might start to build the worry by telling yourself things that aren't true, but it's just the way you're building these catastrophizing thoughts in your head to that worst outcome. So that I'm never going to get a job that I want now. I will never get on in life or have the things that I want, like a car, a house, a family. I will live the rest of my life sad, lonely, and poor. So you're building from just not being successful in the interview to your whole future being blighted and the worst happening. So the alternative is to really step back and say, is this fact or just my opinion right now? And am I reacting from my feelings of anxiety rather than what's real? So what's the best that can happen? And then once you've got that, what's more realistic really? And what can I learn from the feedback, and what can I do to help myself now? So asking people, so the alternative behaviors, so asking people what they thought, how did they learn something, and how did they deal with those difficult sort of situations where an interview hasn't gone to plan. So building a way of going back, thinking it through, and giving yourself some positive statements about the feedback that you get from the interview afterwards, but also what you know you were able to deal with and what might be the areas to pick up on and maybe practice a little bit more on. So that alternative behavior is moving you from worry into problem solving strategies instead. So this is the thought record that I want you to look at and practice for yourself. So I put at the top here, I notice I'm having a thought about. So once you recognize from the triggers that you're having a certain thought, if it's in one of those common thinking styles, just be aware of that and make a note of it. And then see if you can come to some of these alternative thoughts and alternative behaviors. Okay. So that's part of the sort of task between sessions that I want you to focus on. And the other part, which is that behavior part, so the challenging the thinking around those thinking styles is really important because it's starting to shift our automatic perspective into something different. But it won't stick. You won't be able to remind yourself or believe it unless you start taking different actions. So my request to you will be to do one of those thought records or look through what the examples are there and think, well, okay, I could maybe start to challenge that worry thinking, that worst case thinking, by setting up a task for myself of seeing what I'm good at, seeing how I problem solve, and taking note of those times when I start to problem solve and problems don't build. That then, my expectation for something doesn't actually come to plan, and take note of that. So that might be something you want to do. Or if you're fear of failure, fear of making mistakes, you might want to, okay, I'm going to do something that I've never done before. Say like, say it's in a meeting, I'm going to offer to do the report or a feedback or a bit of a presentation or sort of say something in the meeting. And my fear of getting it wrong is going to be quite high. But, what am I going to be challenging in this and how might this help me move forward if I can do that? And what steps do I need? And what support might I need to do that? So let's take an example then of setting a target for the week. So what are we going to do differently? So say it's my fear of making mistakes means that I can't just send an email. I have to go through it 3-4 times, just making sure there's no spelling mistakes, because if there's a mistake, then people are going to think that, oh, she can't do things well enough, that she's, maybe not good enough at this job. So it might be some of this compare or fear of judgment, but also the fear within yourself that I'm letting myself down, I'm proving to myself that I'm not capable. And that must then, lead to other people maybe thinking the same. And so I'm overchecking, spending too much time. It takes me so much time to go through my emails, and then everything else becomes more difficult and I have to stay late every day, and it really interferes with my life. So I want to change that. So maybe I'm going to look through emails I send once. So I will check it, but only once, and then I'm going to send it off. So that changing behavior to accommodate that I'm allowing that maybe sometimes there might be a mistake there, but it doesn't matter. It's going to be okay. And I can experience some anxiety, but over time I get used to it and I learn that nothing bad happens and people don't do anything or say anything differently. And I can get on with my working day much more effectively because of it. Now, so I'm challenging that all or nothing, I must not make a mistake, but I'm also challenging maybe that fear of judgment as well. So what steps do I need to do this? Well, maybe set the intention. So I'm going to, set myself a timer for doing these things, or I'm just going to tick box every time I've done it for the day, to make sure I've done it, and maybe write down what my fear is around sending those emails without a check and seeing what happens when I do it. And the support I might need is just at the end of the day, giving myself that support that I've done what I set out to do, and what does that mean for me that I'm changing this for myself. So sometimes it might be you need support from other people. If you're going to be asking for help, looking at other people, but sometimes it isn't. All right, so that's the basis then for today's session. So it's looking at the thought record, challenging those negative thoughts, but it's also making a change. So from those thought records, seeing if I'm thinking differently from that more balanced perspective, what action might be different, what behavior might change, and then setting yourself one thing that you're going to try out differently. So use the workbook too that I've sent to you, and listen to recording that will be on a YouTube link, and post any questions in the group or via email to me. And we'll be here again next week. So for the final one next week. So that one will be looking really at ways to build the self-worth. So once you've challenged your thinking, it's about how do you start to give yourself a different message that you are capable, that you've got qualities and strengths as good as anybody else. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be good enough, and how you can start to really invest in that. And then finally, just helping each other to maybe set a goal for the future. And for the purposes of learning, for me, helping me by giving me some feedback and maybe a testimonial as well. So next week, same time, 4 o'clock. So hopefully I'll see some of you here live again. And if not, there'll be a recording that will be linked to YouTube that you can access by the end of Friday. Okay, so any questions now from anybody? What I'm going to do is stop sharing and stop recording. Thank you for listening today, and any questions, of course, please message me through. Really happy to help.